The gunshot that echoed through the general store that sweltering August afternoon in 1883 was not aimed at anyone, but it changed everything nonetheless. Helena O'Brien dropped the jar of preserves she had been examining, watching it shatter across the wooden floorboards as her husband Richard stormed in, his pistol still smoking, having fired a warning shot into the ceiling beam. He was drunk again, his face flushed crimson beneath his thinning hair, and she knew from the cruel set of his mouth that tonight would be another long one. What she did not know was that across the street, leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, a cowboy named Xavier Donovan had witnessed the entire scene through the dusty window, and his jaw had tightened with a familiar, helpless rage. Xavier had been watching Helena for 3 years now, ever since he had first ridden into Douglas, Arizona looking for ranch work and found employment at the sprawling Double T Ranch just outside town. He had been 22 then, fresh from Texas, with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a desire to make an honest living. She had been 24, already married for 2 years to Richard O'Brien, the man who owned the lumber mill and half the commercial properties in Douglas. Xavier had seen her that first day walking down Allen Street with a basket over her arm, her dark auburn hair catching the sunlight, and something in his chest had twisted painfully. Then he had seen the purple bruise on her wrist when she reached for a bolt of fabric, seen the way she flinched when Richard grabbed her elbow too roughly, and he had understood that she was not a woman he could court or even speak to beyond polite pleasantries. So he had waited and watched from a distance, loving her in the silent way that hopeless men love hopeless causes. He learned her patterns, the time she came to town, the way she always stopped to feed the stray cats behind the mercantile, how she smiled at children even when her own eyes held such deep sadness. He learned that Richard O'Brien was a mean drunk who had married Helena for her late father's land, which he had promptly sold off for profit. He learned that she had no family left, nowhere to go, and that divorce was not only scandalous but nearly impossible for a woman in their territory without substantial proof of abandonment or extreme cruelty that she could somehow document. Xavier kept his distance because he was a good man, because she was married, and because he understood that his interference could make things worse for her. But every time he saw Richard manhandle her, every time he heard rumors of another drunken rage, every time he glimpsed fresh bruises on her arms when she wore short sleeves in the terrible Arizona heat, something inside him died a little more. The evening after the incident in the general store, Xavier sat in his small room in the ranch bunkhouse, trying to read by lamplight but seeing only Helena's frightened face. His foreman, an older man named Pete, who had taken a liking to the young cowboy, knocked on the doorframe. "You got that look again," Pete said, settling himself on the rough wooden chair. "The one you get whenever you have been in town." Xavier set down his book. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone paying attention, yes." Pete pulled out his pipe, but did not light it, just turned it over in his weathered hands. "You know, son, there are some situations where waiting is the right thing to do and some where it is just cowardice dressed up as virtue. She is married." "She is trapped," Pete corrected. "There is a difference. Richard O'Brien is going to kill that woman someday, whether he means to or not. Whole town knows it. We all just look away because it is easier than getting involved." Xavier stood and paced the small room. "What would you have me do? I am a ranch hand with $40 to my name. She is the wife of the richest man in Douglas. Even if she wanted to leave him, where would she go? What would she do? And what happens to her if I interfere and make things worse?" "I do not have those answers," Pete admitted, "but I know that doing nothing is still a choice, and it is one you will have to live with." After Pete left, Xavier lay awake on his narrow cot, listening to the other ranch hands snoring, thinking about Helena O'Brien and the impossible situation they were both trapped in. He thought about Texas, about his own mother who had endured his father's temper until pneumonia took her when Xavier was 17. He thought about how he had been too young, too powerless to help her, and how that helplessness had followed him like a shadow ever since. Helena, meanwhile, sat in the dark parlor of the large house Richard had built on the hill overlooking Douglas. It was a beautiful home, or would have been if there had been any happiness within its walls. Richard had passed out in his study, and she had locked herself in the parlor, something she had taken to doing when he got into his rages. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to ease the headache that had been building since the afternoon's humiliation. She thought about the cowboy she had seen across the street, the one who always seemed to be somewhere nearby when Richard lost his temper in public. Xavier Donovan. She knew his name because Douglas was a small town and people talked. She knew he worked at the Double T, that he was honest and hard-working, that he never started fights in the saloon but had finished a few when pushed. She knew, though she had never acknowledged it even to herself until recently, that he watched her with a kind of restrained longing that made her heart ache. It was wrong to think of him. She was a married woman, and despite everything, she took her vows seriously. Richard had not always been cruel. In the beginning, he had been charming, attentive even, though she understood now that it had been an act to secure her father's land. The meanness had emerged slowly after the wedding, starting with cutting remarks, then progressing to thrown objects, and finally to the physical violence that had become routine over the past year. She had tried to be a good wife. She kept an immaculate home, prepared the meals Richard liked, never complained, never argued back. But nothing she did seemed to matter. His anger was not really about her. It was about his failing businesses, his gambling debts, his realization that he was not as important or successful as he had imagined he would be. She was simply the nearest target for his frustration. Helena had considered leaving, but where would she go? Her mother was dead, her father was dead, and she had no siblings. The few distant cousins she had were scattered across the country, and she had no money of her own. Richard controlled everything. The few times she had tried to set aside small amounts from the household funds, he had discovered it, and the punishment had been severe. She was well and truly trapped, and she saw no way out except to endure and hope that somehow things would change, though she no longer really believed they would. The next morning, Xavier rode into town to pick up supplies for the ranch. It was a bright September day, the heat already building, though it was barely 8 in the morning. He tied his horse outside the feed store and was loading bags of grain into the wagon when he heard the raised voices. Richard O'Brien stood in the middle of the street, gripping Helena's arm so tightly that Xavier could see his knuckles were white even from 20 feet away. She was trying to pull away, her face pale, her eyes darting around to see who was witnessing this latest humiliation. "I told you I needed that shirt mended by this morning," Richard snarled, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Are you completely incompetent?" "I mended 3 of your shirts last night," Helena said quietly, still trying to pull away. "I must have missed that one. I am sorry." "Sorry does not fix my problem, does it?" Richard shook her roughly. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time doing your actual duties, you would not be such a useless wife." Xavier's hands clenched into fists. He forced himself to stay where he was, forced himself to remember all the reasons why he could not intervene. But then Richard raised his hand as if to strike her, right there in broad daylight, and Xavier found himself moving before conscious thought could stop him. "O'Brien," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Pete Garrison sent me to ask if you had those lumber orders ready. Says the ranch needs them by end of week." Richard turned, his hand still raised, confusion and anger warring on his face. "What? What are you talking about?" "The lumber orders," Xavier repeated, walking closer but keeping his body language casual, non-threatening. "For the new barn. Pete said you were supposed to have the measurements ready this week." "I do not know anything about any lumber orders," Richard said, but his hand had dropped and he had released Helena's arm. She stepped back immediately, rubbing the red marks his fingers had left. "That is strange," Xavier said mildly. "Maybe there is some confusion. Could be Pete got his wires crossed. Sorry to bother you, O'Brien." He tipped his hat to Helena without quite meeting her eyes and turned to walk back to the wagon, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just lied to one of the most powerful men in Douglas, and if Pete had not actually placed those orders, Richard would figure that out soon enough. But it had gotten him to stop, had given Helena a moment to retreat, and Xavier supposed that was worth whatever consequences might come. What he did not see was the look Helena gave him as he walked away, a look of such profound gratitude and confused longing that it would have torn his heart in two. That evening, Richard came home in a fury. He had gone to the lumber mill to check on those supposed orders and found nothing, and it had not taken him long to realize he had been played for a fool. He could not take it out on the cowboy without looking petty and ridiculous, so instead he took it out on Helena. She saw it coming the moment he walked through the door. She had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal, hoping to soften whatever storm was brewing, but she could see from his face that nothing would help tonight. "That cowboy," Richard said slowly, pouring himself a large whiskey, "made me look like an idiot today." "I am sure it was just a misunderstanding," Helena said carefully. "These things happen." "Do not defend him," Richard snapped. "Do not you dare defend him. I saw the way you looked at him." "I did not look at him any particular way. He was just trying to help with a business matter." Richard slammed his glass down hard enough that whiskey sloshed onto the polished table. "Do you think I am stupid? Do you think I do not see the way he watches you? The way he always seems to be around when you are in town?" Helena's stomach turned to ice. "I have never spoken more than 2 words to that man. I have never been inappropriate in any way. You have no cause to accuse me of anything." "I will accuse you of whatever I want," Richard said, his voice rising. "You are my wife. Everything you do reflects on me, and I will not be made a laughingstock because some cowboy has decided to play knight in shining armor." The beating that followed was not the worst she had endured, but it was bad enough. When it was over, when Richard had stormed out to spend the rest of the night drinking at the saloon, Helena dragged herself upstairs and locked herself in the small guest room. She pressed a cold cloth to her split lip and tried not to cry because crying only made her head hurt worse. She thought about Xavier Donovan and felt a confusing mixture of gratitude and guilt and fear. He had tried to help her, and all he had done was make things worse. Now Richard would be watching both of them, suspicious and angry, and she knew that any hint of impropriety, real or imagined, could lead to violence far worse than what she had just endured. Richard's pride was his most dangerous quality, and it had been wounded today. She had to stay away from Xavier. She had to make sure there was never any reason for Richard to believe his suspicions had merit. It was the only way to keep them both safe. But fate and small towns have a way of making such resolutions impossible to keep. 2 weeks later, Helena's horse threw a shoe on the road back from the neighboring town of Bisbee, where she had gone to visit the only person she still considered a friend, a widow named Mrs. Calloway. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent but still blazing hot, and Helena was 3 miles from Douglas with a lame horse and no water. She had already been walking for half an hour, leading the limping mare, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned, her heart sinking, praying it was not Richard, but it was Xavier, riding his big sorrel gelding, and the relief that flooded through her was so powerful it almost made her dizzy. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said, pulling up beside her. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see the concern in his dark eyes. "Looks like you're having some trouble." "My horse threw a shoe," she said, hearing how tired her voice sounded. "I am walking back to town." "That is still a good 2.5 miles in this heat," Xavier said. He dismounted and examined her mare's hoof. She should not be walked much further without risking real injury. Helena closed her eyes briefly. "What do you suggest?" "I can ride into town, get the farrier to come out with his tools, and come back for you. But that will take the better part of 2 hours, and you will be stuck out here in the heat with no water." "Or?" she asked, because she could hear the unspoken alternative in his voice. "Or you can ride my horse into town while I wait here with yours. That way you can get the farrier yourself and come back." It was the logical solution, but Helena hesitated. Being alone with Xavier, even for the few minutes it would take her to mount his horse and ride away, felt dangerous, not because she feared him, but because she did not quite trust herself. She was so tired of being afraid, so tired of being hurt, and the kindness in his eyes made her want to weep. "That seems the best solution," she finally said, "and thank you, Mr. Donovan." "Xavier," he said quietly, "you can call me Xavier. No one is around to hear." She should not have done it, should have kept the formal distance between them, but his name slipped out before she could stop herself. "Xavier, then. And I am Helena, though you probably should not call me that." "Probably not," he agreed. But something in his expression had softened. He helped her onto his horse, his hands careful and respectful, and she caught the scent of leather and sage and something uniquely him. For just a moment their eyes met, and the longing in his gaze was so naked, so raw, that it took her breath away. "Helena," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "If you ever need help, real help, I want you to know that I would do anything, go anywhere. I have some money saved. Not much, but enough to get you somewhere safe if you ever decided to leave." She should have rebuked him, should have reminded him that she was married, and such talk was improper. Instead, she found herself saying, "Why? You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you are kind to stray animals and children. I know you have a beautiful smile, even though you do not smile much anymore. I know you deserve better than what you have, and I know that I have been half in love with you since the first moment I saw you, and that watching you suffer and not being able to help is the hardest thing I have ever done." Tears burned in Helena's eyes. No one had spoken to her like that in so long. No one had looked at her the way Xavier was looking at her now, as if she were precious and worthy of protection. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "I cannot leave," she whispered. "You must understand that. Even if I wanted to, I have nowhere to go. And if Richard found me, which he would, it would be so much worse for both of us." "I know," Xavier said, and the defeat in his voice nearly broke her. "I know all that, but I needed you to know that someone sees you, that someone cares, that you are not as alone as you think you are." "You cannot love me," Helena said, and now the tears were spilling over. "It is not fair to either of us. It can only lead to pain." "It already leads to pain," Xavier said, "but at least now you know the truth." She rode away without looking back, because if she had looked back, she might have done something foolish. She might have turned around and ridden right past Douglas, might have asked him to take her somewhere, anywhere else. But she had lived long enough in the real world to know that such romantic notions led nowhere good. Running away required money, resources, a plan. It required a destination where Richard could not find them. And even if they managed all that, she would be a fallen woman, an adulteress, forever cut off from decent society. And Xavier would be the man who had stolen another man's wife, which would follow him wherever he went. So she did what she had always done. She endured. She got the farrier, brought him back to where Xavier waited with her mare, and thanked both men politely while keeping her eyes averted. She rode home and told Richard what had happened, leaving out the conversation but including everything else, because she had learned that half-truths were safer than outright lies when he was in an interrogating mood. But something had changed. Xavier's words had planted a seed, a tiny kernel of hope that maybe there could be a different life, a different future. It was dangerous, that hope. It made the present harder to bear. But she held on to it anyway because it was all she had. The autumn of 1883 passed slowly. Xavier threw himself into ranch work, volunteering for the hardest jobs, the longest rides, anything to exhaust himself enough that he could sleep without dreaming of auburn hair and sad eyes. Pete watched him with concern but said nothing, understanding that some lessons had to be learned through pain. Helena moved through her days like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically while her mind wandered to possibilities she should not be considering. Richard's drinking had gotten worse, and with it his temper. She had become adept at hiding bruises, at making excuses, at arranging her face into pleasant neutrality no matter what was happening inside. The town doctor had treated her 3 times in the past 2 months, always for falls or accidents, and the sympathy in his eyes told her he did not believe her lies but would not press the issue. It was mid-November when things came to a head. Richard had been on a 3-day drunk, one of his worst. He had lost a substantial amount of money in a poker game, and one of his business partners had pulled out of a timber contract, costing him even more. He came home on a cold Tuesday evening, and Helena knew from the set of his shoulders that this would be bad. "Where is my dinner?" was the first thing he said, even though it was laid out on the table, still steaming. "Right here," Helena said carefully. "I made the roast you like." "It is cold," he said, though it clearly was not. "I just took it out of the oven. It is hot." "Are you calling me a liar?" His voice was dangerous now, low and controlled in the way that always preceded violence. "No, I am simply saying that the food is hot. Please sit down and eat before it actually does get cold." What happened next occurred so quickly that Helena barely had time to register it. Richard grabbed the platter of roast and hurled it against the wall, meat and gravy splattering across the cream-colored wallpaper. Then he grabbed Helena by the throat and slammed her against the wall so hard that the pictures hanging there rattled. "You think you are so clever," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath thick with whiskey. "You think you are better than me. I see it in your eyes, the judgment, the contempt." Helena could not breathe. His hand was crushing her windpipe, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She clawed at his wrist, trying to pull his hand away, but he was so much stronger. This was different from the other times. This was not a beating he would stop when he got tired. This was murder. She heard a roaring in her ears, felt her body going limp, and thought with odd clarity that this was how she would die. In this beautiful house, at the hands of the man who had promised to love and cherish her, and no one would ever know the truth. But then suddenly the pressure was gone and she was sliding down the wall, gasping and choking, air rushing back into her lungs in painful gulps. Through watering eyes, she saw Richard stumbling backward, saw another figure in the room, and for a confused moment could not understand what was happening. Xavier stood between her and Richard, his stance balanced and ready, his face terrible with rage. "Touch her again, and I will kill you," he said, and his voice was so cold, so absolutely certain that even Richard in his drunken fury took a step back. "This is my house," Richard blustered. "That is my wife. You have no right to be here." "I was delivering lumber invoice to your business office, saw the door was open, heard the noise, and came in to make sure everything was all right," Xavier said. His words clipped. "And I arrived to find you strangling your wife. So you can file charges against me for trespassing if you want, but we will see what the sheriff has to say about attempted murder." "Attempted murder," Richard scoffed, but there was fear in his eyes now. It was an argument. Husbands and wives argue. "That was not an argument. That was you trying to kill her." Xavier glanced back at Helena, who was still crumpled against the wall, her hand at her throat, her breathing ragged. The sight of her like that seemed to ignite something in him. "Mrs. O'Brien, do you want to press charges? Do you want me to get the sheriff?" Helena's mind raced. If she said yes, Richard would be arrested, but probably not for long. He had friends, influence, money. He would be out within hours, and his rage would be uncontrollable, and Xavier would have made an enemy for life. But if she said no, Richard would know he could get away with anything, that there was literally no limit to what he could do to her. "I need to think," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and painful. "I need time to think." "You're coming with me," Xavier said, "right now. You can think somewhere safe." "You cannot just take my wife," Richard said, his bravado returning now that the immediate danger seemed to be passing. "That is kidnapping." "I am not taking her anywhere she does not want to go," Xavier said. "Helena, do you want to come with me? Even just for tonight, just to somewhere safe where you can decide what you want to do? It was the question she had been waiting 3 years to be asked, the permission she had been afraid to give herself. She looked at Richard, at the man who had slowly destroyed everything good in her, and then at Xavier, at the man who had loved her from a distance and asked for nothing in return. The choice should have been impossible. The choice was terrifyingly simple. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want to go with you." Xavier helped her to her feet, keeping himself between her and Richard the entire time. "Get some clothes," he told her, "quickly, whatever you need for a few days." Helena moved like a woman in a dream. She went upstairs, pulled out a carpet bag, and stuffed it with dresses, undergarments, her few pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the clasps, but she forced herself to keep moving. This was happening. She was actually leaving. When she came back downstairs, Richard was standing in the parlor. And for the first time in their marriage, he looked genuinely afraid. "Helena, wait," he said. "Let us talk about this. I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. I have been under a lot of stress, but that is no excuse. Please do not do this. People will talk. Your reputation will be ruined." "My reputation," Helena repeated, and she almost wanted to laugh. "You nearly killed me, and you're worried about my reputation? Where will you even go? What will you do? You have no money, no family. You need me." "No," Helena said, and the word felt like freedom. "I do not need you. I have not needed you for a long time. I have just been too afraid to admit it." "You are making a mistake," Richard said, and now his voice was turning hard again. "If you walk out that door with him, you can never come back. I will divorce you. I will tell everyone you are an adulteress. I will make sure you are a social pariah. No decent person will speak to you." "Then I will be an honest pariah," Helena said. "Better that than a respectable corpse." Xavier took her bag and offered her his arm. She took it, feeling the solid strength of him, and let him lead her out of the house that had been her prison. Behind them, Richard shouted threats and curses, but neither of them looked back. Xavier had left his horse tied near the business office as he had claimed. He helped Helena mount, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. She leaned back against his chest, feeling safer than she had in 3 years, and let him carry her away into the night. He took her to Mrs. Calloway's house in Bisbee, the widow who was Helena's one friend. It was a 2-hour ride through the cold November darkness, and they barely spoke, but Helena felt Xavier's warmth at her back, felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, and something in her that had been broken for so long began to tentatively heal. Mrs. Calloway took one look at Helena's bruised throat and red-rimmed eyes and pulled her inside without questions. "You stay here as long as you need," she said firmly. "My house is your house." Xavier lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I will leave you ladies alone," he said. "Mrs. O'Brien, I will come by tomorrow if that's all right. We need to figure out what happens next." "Thank you," Helena said, and the words were inadequate for what he had done, but they were all she had. "Xavier, thank you for saving my life." "I just wish I'd done it sooner," he said quietly, and then he was gone. Mrs. Calloway made tea and drew a bath and helped Helena undress, clucking over the bruises that covered her ribs and back. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "A long time," Helena admitted. "I was ashamed. I thought if I could just be a better wife, if I could just do things right, he would stop. But it was never about me. It was about him." "Of course it was," Mrs. Calloway said gently. "Men like that, they need someone to hurt. It makes them feel powerful. You could have been perfect, and it would not have made a bit of difference." Helena soaked in the hot water and let herself cry, really cry. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she cried for the naive girl who had married Richard, thinking she was making a good match. She cried for 3 years of fear and pain and loneliness. She cried for the life she had lost and the uncertain future that lay ahead. And somewhere in all that crying, she felt a weight lifting. felt the possibility of something new beginning to take shape. Xavier, riding back to Douglas in the cold darkness, felt like he had been torn in half. He had done what he had been wanting to do for 3 years. He had gotten Helena away from Richard, but the reality of what that meant was settling over him like a heavy blanket. She was still married. They had committed no crime, no adultery, but everyone would assume they had. Richard would absolutely file for divorce and name Xavier as the cause, whether or not it was true. Helena's reputation would be destroyed, and Xavier's job at the Double T was almost certainly finished. No respectable rancher would keep on a hand who had been involved in such a scandal. But when he thought about Helena's face as Richard's hands closed around her throat, when he remembered the absolute terror in her eyes, he knew he would do it all again. Some things were more important than reputation or respectability or financial security. Some things were worth sacrificing everything for. He just hoped Helena felt the same way. The next morning, Xavier rode to Bisbee with Pete, who had insisted on coming along once he heard what had happened. They found Helena sitting in Mrs. Calloway's small parlor, dressed in a plain gray dress, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, but calmer, and the bruises on her throat had darkened to an ugly purple. "Mrs. O'Brien," Pete said, taking off his hat. "I am Pete Garrison, Xavier's foreman. I wanted you to know that the Double T stands behind both of you. You need a place to stay. We have a small house on the property that is empty. You need money? I can advance Xavier's wages. And if O'Brien tries to cause trouble, he will have to go through all of us." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Garrison, but I cannot ask you to risk your reputation for me." "You are not asking. I am offering." Pete's weathered face was serious. "I had a sister once. Her husband killed her when I was too far away to help. I swore I would never stand by again if I saw a woman in danger. So please, let us help you." Xavier had not known that about Pete. The pain in the older man's eyes told him it was a story rarely shared. He felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost choked him. Helena looked at Xavier, her green eyes searching his face. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "You have done so much already. You have turned your life upside down for someone you barely know. What do you want to happen now?" Xavier sat down across from her, turning his hat in his hands. "I want you to be safe," he said. "I want you to be happy. I want you to have the life you deserve. Beyond that, it is your choice. If you want to file for divorce and start over somewhere new, I will help you do that. If you want to stay in Arizona and rebuild your life here, I will support that. If you want nothing to do with me because I remind you of the worst night of your life, I will understand that too." "And if I wanted to be with you?" Helena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I wanted to see where this could go between us, what then?" Xavier's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone in the room could hear it. "Then I would be the happiest man in Arizona," he said honestly. "But Helena, you need to understand what that would mean. Richard will divorce you and drag your name through the mud. People will assume we were having an affair long before last night. You will be ostracized from decent society. Your life will be much harder than it would be if you made a clean break and started over somewhere no one knows you." "I know all that," Helena said. "I have been thinking about it all night, and here is what I have realized. I have spent 3 years living for other people's opinions, living up to expectations, being the perfect wife to a man who did not deserve my loyalty. I am done with that. I want to live for myself now. I want to make choices based on what I want, not what society thinks I should want." "And what do you want?" Xavier asked. Helena stood and crossed to where he sat. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "I want to know the man who has been watching over me for 3 years. I want to know what it feels like to be loved by someone who sees me as more than property. I want a chance at happiness, even if that chance is scandalous and difficult and uncertain. I want you, Xavier Donovan, if you will have me." Xavier stood and took her hands in his, careful of the bruises on her wrists. "I will have you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will have you today and tomorrow and every day you will let me. I will work to give you a good life. I will protect you. I will love you the way you deserve to be loved. That is my promise to you." They stood there, hands clasped, eyes locked, while Mrs. Calloway dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Pete cleared his throat roughly. It was not a wedding, not even an engagement really, but it felt like a vow all the same. The next few months were hard. Months, Richard filed for divorce as promised and named Xavier as co-respondent, claiming adultery, though he could prove nothing. The scandal rocked Douglas. Half the town was convinced that Helena and Xavier had been carrying on an affair for years. The other half was more sympathetic, having heard rumors of Richard's violence. But even they thought Helena had acted improperly in leaving with another man. Helena moved into the small house on the Double T property, and she and Xavier were scrupulous about propriety. He did not spend nights there. He barely even visited unless someone else was present. They were building a friendship, a courtship, but they both understood that anything more would have to wait until the divorce was final and enough time had passed to make marriage socially acceptable. It was a strange time. Helena had more freedom than she had known in years, but she was also more isolated. Women who had been friendly acquaintances crossed the street rather than speak to her. She was not invited to church socials or sewing circles. She was effectively cut off from female society, but she was also not being beaten. She was not walking on eggshells, not flinching at loud noises, not planning her days around avoiding a husband's drunken rages. She could breathe. She could think. She could slowly remember who she had been before Richard had systematically destroyed her confidence and her spirit. Xavier courted her the way he had always imagined he would if circumstances had been different. He brought her wildflowers from the range. He took her on carefully chaperoned rides through the desert. He talked to her, really talked, about his life and his dreams and his fears. He learned that she loved to read but had not been allowed books because Richard thought they gave women foolish ideas. He learned that she could play the piano beautifully but had stopped because Richard hated the noise. He learned that she wanted children someday but had been secretly grateful she had never conceived with Richard because she could not bear the thought of bringing a child into that violent home. In turn, Helena learned about Xavier, about his difficult childhood, his mother's suffering, his determination to be a better man than his father, about his love of horses and open spaces, his code of honor that made him protective of those weaker than himself, about his dreams of someday owning his own small ranch. Nothing fancy, just a place that was his where he could build a good life. They fell in love slowly, properly, the way people are supposed to fall in love. Not in a sudden passionate rush, but in a gentle unfolding of trust and understanding and deepening affection. By the time spring came in 1884, they both knew this was forever. The divorce was finalized in March, a surprisingly quick process because Richard wanted to be rid of the embarrassment of a runaway wife. The judge granted it on grounds of desertion, which was ironic given the circumstances. But Helena did not fight it. She just wanted it over. Xavier waited another month after the divorce was final, wanting to be respectful of convention, but on a warm April evening he could not wait any longer. He took Helena riding out to a high mesa overlooking the sprawling Arizona landscape, and as the sun set in brilliant streaks of orange and gold, he got down on one knee. "Helena O'Brien," he said, "I have loved you for longer than I have known you. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, making you laugh, making you feel safe and loved and cherished. Will you marry me?" Helena looked down at him. This man who had saved her life and then given her the space to heal, who had loved her patiently and asked for nothing in return. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He slipped a simple silver ring on her finger. It was all he could afford, but Helena looked at it like it was made of diamonds. They held each other as the sun sank below the horizon and the desert cooled around them, and Helena thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. They were married in early May in a simple ceremony at the courthouse in Tucson, far enough from Douglas to avoid gossip but close enough that Pete and Mrs. Calloway could attend. Helena wore a pale blue dress and carried wildflowers. Xavier wore his best suit and could not stop smiling. It was not the grand wedding she had imagined as a girl, but it was real and honest and full of joy, which was infinitely better. They moved into the small house on the Double T, which Xavier had spent weeks fixing up. He had built new furniture, repainted the walls, planted a small garden. It was not much, but it was theirs, and Helena loved every inch of it. Their first year of marriage was blissful despite the lingering scandal. Xavier worked hard at the ranch, and Helena helped out with cooking and mending for the other hands, earning her keep and slowly winning over even the most skeptical cowboys with her kindness and good humor. They were building a life together, building a future. In the evenings, they would sit on their small porch and watch the sunset, Helena leaning against Xavier's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and talk about their dreams. Xavier was still saving money toward buying his own land. Helena was learning to ride better, to shoot, to do all the things that would make her a true rancher's wife. They were happy in a way that felt almost miraculous after everything they had been through. It was Pete who brought them news of Richard in August of 1884. "Thought you should know," he said, sitting on their porch with a cup of coffee. "O'Brien's business is failing, lost some big contracts, and he is deep in debt. Drinking worse than ever. There is talk he might lose the mill." Helena felt a complicated mixture of emotions. She could not help a small sense of vindication that the man who had treated her so cruelly was facing consequences, even if they were unrelated to his abuse. But she also felt sad that he had squandered every opportunity life had given him. "I hope he gets help," she said quietly. "I hope he stops drinking and turns his life around." Xavier squeezed her hand, proud of her generosity even toward a man who had nearly killed her. But Richard did not get help. His business collapsed entirely by December, and he left Douglas in disgrace, headed for California to try to start over. Helena heard the news from Mrs. Calloway, who had come to visit, and felt only relief that he was gone, that there would be no chance encounters in town, no possibility of him trying to reclaim what he believed was his. With Richard gone, the scandal began to fade. People had new gossip to occupy them. And slowly, very slowly, Helena was readmitted to the edges of respectable society. Some women would never forgive her for leaving her husband, but others, particularly those who had heard the rumors of Richard's violence, began to soften. An invitation to a church social here, a nod of greeting on the street there. It was not full acceptance, but it was a start. In the spring of 1885, Helena discovered she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening as they sat on the porch, her heart fluttering with nervousness. She had wanted this, they both had, but after everything she had been through, she could not quite believe she was allowed to be this happy. Xavier's face went through a series of emotions, shock, joy, wonder, and then he was pulling her into his arms and spinning her around, laughing like a madman. "We are having a baby," he kept saying. "We are having a baby." "We are," Helena said, laughing and crying. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Xavier set her down and framed her face in his hands. "Helena, I am beyond happy. This is everything I have ever wanted. You, a child, a family of our own. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was healthy and uneventful, and Helena bloomed like a flower finally given enough water and sunlight. She no longer had shadows under her eyes. She laughed freely and often. She sang while she worked. She was becoming the person she had been meant to be all along before fear and violence had tried to break her. Xavier was overprotective to the point of comedy. He barely wanted her to lift anything heavier than a teacup. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on. He drove Helena slightly crazy with his hovering, but she loved him for it. Their son was born in December of 1885 during a rare cold snap that left frost on the desert scrub. The birth was difficult, longer than expected, and Xavier paced outside the door for 10 hours while Mrs. Calloway and the midwife worked inside. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst into the room despite propriety and found Helena propped up on pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny red-faced bundle. "It is a boy," she said softly. "We have a son." Xavier approached the bed like a man in a dream. He looked down at the tiny infant, at his son, and felt something shift in his chest. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Helena. Thank you for this." They named him Thomas, after Helena's father, and he was a calm, easy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world with his father's dark eyes. Xavier was besotted. He would hold Thomas for hours, just staring at him in wonder, marveling that this perfect little person was his. Helena watched her husband with their son and felt her heart expand. This was what family was supposed to be. This gentleness, this love, this sense of safety and belonging. She had not truly understood what she had been missing until she had it. In 1886, when Thomas was 8 months old, Xavier finally had enough money saved to buy a small piece of land about 5 miles from Douglas. It was only 80 acres, but it had water, good grazing, and a decent place to build a house. He bought it outright. No mortgage, because he never wanted to risk losing it to debt. They built a modest house together, Xavier doing most of the work with help from the double T hands who had become his friends. Helena helped where she could, planning the layout, choosing paint colors, planting another garden. It took 6 months, but when it was done, they had a real home, a place that was entirely theirs. The day they moved in, Helena stood in the kitchen and cried happy tears. "This is ours," she kept saying, "really ours. No one can take it away." "No one can take it away," Xavier confirmed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "This is our home, Helena. Yours, mine, and Thomas's. We are going to build a good life here." And they did. Xavier started a small cattle operation, just a few dozen head to start with, and gradually built it up. Helena raised chickens, kept a large garden, and sold eggs and vegetables in town. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. More children came. A daughter, Mary, in 1888, with her mother's auburn hair and green eyes. Another son, James, in 1890, who inherited Xavier's adventurous spirit and gave them constant heart attacks with his fearless climbing. Another daughter, Ruth, in 1892, quieter than her siblings, thoughtful and kind. The house expanded with the family, new rooms added on as they could afford them. The ranch prospered. Xavier's reputation as an honest, hard-working cattleman spread, and he became respected in the community. Helena, too, was gradually accepted back into society as years passed and memories of old scandals faded. She would never be a social leader in Douglas, but she had friends, people who respected her, and that was enough. They faced hardships, droughts that killed cattle and withered crops, illnesses that swept through the family, terrifying nights when they were not sure if one of the children would survive, financial setbacks that required starting over. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. On a warm September evening in 1895, Helena and Xavier sat on their porch, watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. Their children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Thomas was 9 now, already helping with the cattle. Mary was learning to cook and drive her mother to distraction with her stubborn independence. James was 5 and convinced he would be a famous cowboy. Ruth was 3 and currently trying to convince her father to let her have a kitten. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Helena asked, leaning against Xavier's shoulder. "If you had not been there that night? If you had not been brave enough to interfere?" "I think about it sometimes," Xavier admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you. It terrifies me." "You waited for me," Helena said softly. "For 3 years you watched and waited and loved me from a distance, asking for nothing. That is the most patient, selfless love I have ever known." "It was not entirely selfless," Xavier said with a small smile. "I was hoping the whole time that somehow, someday things would change, and I would have a chance. I just never imagined it would happen the way it did. I never thanked you properly, O'Brien, Helena said, for saving my life, for giving me a chance at happiness, for being the man you are. Xavier turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his life, who had given him everything he had ever wanted. You thank me every day, he said. Every time you smile, every time you laugh, every time you look at me like I hung the moon, every time I watch you with our children and see the mother you are, so patient and loving. You thank me just by being happy, Helena. That is all I ever wanted. I am happy, Helena said, and her voice was full of wonder as if she still could not quite believe it. After everything, after all the darkness, I am truly, genuinely happy. And it is because of you. They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, surrounded by the sounds of their children playing in the home they had built together on the land they had earned through hard work and determination. It was not the life either of them had imagined as young people. It was better. The years continued to pass. Xavier and Helena grew older together. Their children grew up and started families of their own. Thomas took over the ranch and expanded it, proving to have his father's good sense and his mother's determination. Mary married a school teacher and moved to Tucson, where she became involved in women's suffrage. James became a lawman, driven by his father's sense of justice. Ruth stayed close to home and married a neighboring rancher, giving Xavier and Helena the joy of grandchildren they could see regularly. Through it all, through decades of life's joys and sorrows, Xavier and Helena remained devoted to each other. The passionate romance of their early years mellowed into a deep, abiding love that was no less powerful for its quietness. They still held hands. They still talked for hours. They still looked at each other like they could not quite believe their luck. On a spring day in 1920, Xavier and Helena celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. They were in their 60s now, gray-haired and slower moving, but still very much in love. Their children threw them a party, and the house was full of family, grandchildren running everywhere, laughter and music filling the rooms. At one point, Helena found Xavier standing on the porch, looking out over the land they had built their life on. She slipped her hand into his, fitting perfectly into the space beside him the way she had for decades. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how it all started," Xavier said. "About that scared woman I saw through a store window so many years ago, about how I thought I would never have a chance with her, that I would just have to love her from afar forever. And look at us now. Look at this life we have built." "It is a good life," Helena said. "The best life. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard parts?" Xavier asked. "Not even the scandal, the gossip, the struggle?" "Not even those," Helena said firmly, "because they led me here, to you, to this. And this is everything I ever needed." Xavier pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "I love you, Helena Donovan," he said. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Helena said, "my patient cowboy, my savior, my partner, my love." They stood together on the porch, surrounded by family. Having built a legacy that would last generations, they had taken a terrible situation and transformed it into something beautiful. They had chosen courage over fear, love over convention, hope over despair. And in doing so, they had created a love story that would be told among their descendants for years to come. The story of the woman who had been trapped in a loveless marriage, and the cowboy who had waited for her, who had loved her from a distance until the moment came when he could love her up close. The story of two people who had defied society's expectations and built a life on their own terms. The story of patience rewarded, courage honored, and love triumphant. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than a fairy tale. It was real, and it was theirs. Xavier lived to be 72. passing peacefully in his sleep in 1930 after a full day working on the ranch he loved. Helena held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude, promising she would see him again. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a sprawling family. In the end, Helena was laid to rest beside Xavier on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a simple stone that read, "Helena and Xavier Donovan. They loved well and lived fully." And that perhaps was the truest summary of their life together. They had loved well. They had lived fully. They had taken the broken pieces of their early years and crafted something whole and beautiful. They had shown that it was never too late to choose happiness, never too late to be brave, never too late to start over. Their story became a legend in Douglas, Arizona, the tale of the patient cowboy and the woman he had loved from a distance, who had finally found their way to each other despite impossible odds. It was told at family gatherings, passed down through generations, a reminder that love, real love, the kind that waits and hopes and endures, was worth any price. And in a small house on a hill outside Douglas, where their great-great-grandchildren now lived, there was a portrait of a young couple, dark-haired and bright-eyed, looking at each other with expressions of such profound love and joy that anyone who saw it could not help but smile. That portrait, painted in 1886 just after Thomas was born, captured the essence of Xavier and Helena Donovan, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love when it would have been easier to choose safety, who had built a life together that became a testament to the power of patience, courage, and unwavering devotion. Their love story was not perfect. It was messy and complicated and scandalous. It began in violence and fear, but it ended in peace and fulfillment, in a house full of family, in two lives well lived. And that transformation, from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from lonely watching to joyful togetherness, was what made their story worth telling. Xavier Donovan had waited for Helena O'Brien for 3 long years, loving her from a distance, asking for nothing in return. And when the moment came, when she needed him most, he had been there. He had saved her life and then given her the space to heal, to find herself again, to choose him freely rather than out of desperation. Helena O'Brien Donovan had endured years of abuse, had survived what should have killed her, and had found the courage to leave everything behind for a chance at real happiness. She had chosen love over security, honesty over reputation, freedom over the gilded cage of a loveless marriage. Together, they had proven that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that require patience, that wait through years of longing, that begin with a rescue but become so much more, that survive scandal and hardship and the judgment of others, that grows stronger with time rather than fading. Their story was a Wild West romance in the truest sense, not because of gunfights or outlaws, though those elements existed on the periphery of their lives, but because it captured the essence of that time and place, the harshness of the Arizona desert, the strict social codes that governed behavior, the isolation that made choosing courage all the more difficult, the sense that anything was possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. In the end, Xavier and Helena's story was a simple one, told in countless variations across time and culture. It was the story of two people who loved each other, who faced obstacles and overcame them, who built a life together that brought them joy. But in its particulars, in the specific details of how Xavier waited and Helena endured and they finally came together, it was unique. It was theirs. And that uniqueness, that specificity, was what made their story matter. Not just to them, not just to their descendants, but to anyone who has ever loved someone they thought they could never have, to anyone who has ever waited patiently for their moment, to anyone who has ever had to be brave enough to walk away from everything they knew for a chance at something better. Xavier and Helena's story said that such bravery was possible, that such patience could be rewarded, that such love could endure and flourish. It was a message of hope wrapped in the dusty, sun-baked reality of 1880s Arizona, and it resonated across generations because hope, real hope, never goes out of style. So when the great-great-grandchildren looked at that portrait, when they heard the stories passed down through the family, they were not just learning about their ancestors, they were learning about the power of love, the importance of courage, the value of patience. They were learning that sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, and that sometimes waiting for the right person is worth any amount of time. Xavier and Helena Donovan left behind more than just descendants and a ranch. They left behind a legacy of love, a story that reminded everyone who heard it that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of redemption, of transformation, of finding unexpected happiness. Their love story was complete, its ending as satisfying as any romance could hope to be. Two people who had found each other, who had loved each other well, who had built something lasting. It was not dramatic in the way of legends. There were no showdowns at high noon, no chases across the desert, no last-minute rescues from stagecoach robberies. But there was drama in Xavier's 3-year vigil. In the night, he burst into that house and saved Helena's life. In their decision to face scandal together, in the slow building of a life and a family against the odds. There was romance in every patient day Xavier waited. In every moment, Helena found the strength to keep going. In every choice they made to choose each other over and over again. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The sun set over the ranch one last time on their story, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the same colors that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, and all the quiet moments of love in between. The land they had worked so hard to keep remained in the family, a testament to their labor and their love. Their children's children's children walked the same paths they had walked, worked the same land they had worked, and carried their story forward. And somewhere in the hearts of all who knew the story, Xavier and Helena Donovan lived on. The cowboy who had waited, the woman who had found the courage to be free. Two people who had loved each other from the first moment and had never stopped, not for a single day, until death and beyond. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, rooted in patience and courage, flowering into something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone, and that, in the end, was the greatest legacy anyone could hope to leave behind.